Welcome to Create More Intimacy, a podcast for men. I'm Elisa Stoddard, and I help successful men stop chasing sex and start building real connection so they finally feel close, connected, and wanted again. A lot of couples don't realize when they start talking to each other differently. The patience gets thinner, defensiveness shows up. What used to feel easier starts feeling sharp, tense, easier to misunderstand. And often, what is underneath that is not that they stopped caring, it's that enough hurt piled up. Enough conversations went wrong, and nobody really knew how to repair what was happening beneath it. That slow buildup changes more than most people realize. Welcome to episode 47, Why Couples Get Meaner When Hurt Goes Unrepaired. Most couples do not fall apart because of one singular major event. It happens much more quietly than that. A conversation goes wrong. Someone says something sharp. Someone shuts down. An apology happens, or maybe it doesn't, but either way, the moment passes and life kept moving. Work needs attention. Kids need something. Dinner still has to happen. So both people move forward, at least on the surface. But something small stays behind. Not always obvious. Just a little disappointment, a little more hesitation, a little less warmth. And because nothing dramatic happened, it's easy to assume it does not matter that much. Until months pass, sometimes years. And now, the way you talk to each other has changed. You interrupt each other faster. You explain yourself sooner. You assume tone. You brace before hard conversations even begin. And what once felt like two people trying now starts sounding like two people keeping score. That is why couples rarely fall apart from one big issue. They wear down through hundreds of small moments that never really got repaired. Many men notice this only when they start wondering why everything else feels so charged. Why she reacts strongly to something that feels so small. Why old issues keep resurfacing. And why, even when they say sorry, it still does not seem finished. What many men do not understand at first is that an apology and repair aren't the same thing, even though they often feel interchangeable when you are the one who wants the tension to end. And maybe before going further, it would help to name what repair actually is. Most couples use that word without really being taught what it looks like. Repair is not simply saying sorry. It's not ending the conversation or hoping that enough time passes that things just settle down on their own. Real repair means understanding what landed so badly, staying present long enough for the other person to feel that their hurt matters, and responding in a way that creates closeness instead of more distance. A man will often say he's sorry because, in his mind, he already knows he did not mean to harm. He regrets that the conversation went badly, and he wants to put the moment behind him as fast as he can so that both of them can move forward. From his perspective, saying sorry is an attempt to calm things down, to show good intent, and then to stop adding weight to something that already feels super uncomfortable. But for many women, what matters first is not that the apology happened. It's whether the hurt itself was understood and acknowledged. That is why a conversation can seem finished to him and unfinished to her at the exact same time. She may circle back later, not because she wants another fight, but because the original pain never landed in a way that felt received. Something in his response may have moved too quickly forward towards an explanation, toward defending intent, toward wanting the discomfort to be over, before she truly felt understood. And that is often where men become frustrated. They think, I already said sorry. Why are we still here? Why are we talking about this again? Why can't she just let it go? What they often don't realize is that unresolved hurt returns because It has not been settled internally, not because someone is trying to punish them by bringing it up again. If the response to her pain sounds irritated or impatient or defensive, even subtly, the original hurt usually deepens rather than softens, because now the message she hears is that her pain itself has become inconvenient. This is where shame quietly enters for many men, although they may not name it that way. Hurting someone they love often leaves them deeply uncomfortable. And instead of staying present with that discomfort, they rush towards fixing, clarifying, or trying to prove that they're not the kind of person who meant to cause harm and damage. But repair is not built by escaping discomfort quickly. Repair usually requires staying with impact long enough that the other person no longer feels alone in what happened. That may mean listening longer than feels comfortable, resisting the urge to explain immediately, and understanding that hearing pain is not the same thing as being seen as the bad guy. Because when a man becomes angry that she is still hurt, he often creates the very distance he is hoping to avoid. What could have become closeness through understanding instead becomes another moment added to the growing pile, another conversation that looks finished on the outside but leaves something unresolved underneath. And over time, those unresolved moments begin shaping the relationship more than either person realizes. One of the reasons repair becomes difficult in long-term relationships is that very few people realize how quickly defensiveness changes the direction of a conversation. A difficult moment may begin with one person trying, however imperfectly, to describe something that hurt, but if the response immediately shifts towards correcting the details, explaining intent, or pointing out what the other person also did wrong, the conversation usually stops being about understanding and starts becoming about self-protection. And once that happens, both people begin listening differently. Instead of listening for what is being revealed, they listen for what feels unfair. They listen for exaggeration. They listen for tone. They listen for what needs to be corrected before something lands too heavily. That is often why conversations that begin with one small issue suddenly pull in 5 older ones, because neither person feels fully heard in the present. So older pain comes rushing in to support what they are trying to say now. A wife may begin by saying she felt dismissed, but if his response quickly becomes, "That is not what I meant," or "You are leaving out what happened before that," she often hears that as distance rather than care, even if he believes he's just simply being accurate. To him, accuracy matters because defensiveness often feels like survival. If he already feels ashamed or misunderstood or afraid of failing again, correcting the conversation can feel safer than staying inside something painful that he doesn't fully know how to sit with and hold. But the problem is that defensiveness rarely settles the pain. It usually adds another layer to it, because now the original hurt is still present, and on top of that, there is the feeling of having to fight to be taken seriously. Over time, that just changes the emotional tone between two people. What might once have been brought up gently begins coming out sharper. Patience shortens, tone hardens, and the benefit of the doubt starts disappearing because too many past moments ended with both people feeling alone instead of understood. This is where resentment often begins doing its quiet work, not through dramatic betrayal, but through repeated experiences of feeling that vulnerability does not lead anywhere helpful. And resentment rarely announces itself clearly at first. It often sounds like irritation. It sounds like impatience, like bringing up something small with more edge than the moment seemed to deserve. Because by then, the conversation is no longer carrying only what happened today. It is carrying other moments that never fully settled, other disappointments that still live just beneath the surface. That is why some couples become surprisingly sharp with each other over things that seem minor from the outside. What is being reacted to is often much older than the moment itself. One of the more painful shifts in a marriage is that hurt rarely keeps sounding like hurt once resentment has time to build. At first, people usually try to explain themselves more directly. They say they feel dismissed, disappointed, lonely, frustrated, or overwhelmed. And even if the conversation is imperfect, there is often still an effort to be understood. But when enough conversations leave both people feeling unresolved, the language begins to change. What comes out no longer sounds as vulnerable as what is actually being felt underneath it. It comes out sharper, more critical, sometimes more punishing than the moment seemed to need. A comment about tone becomes a comment about always being interrupted. A disagreement about plans becomes a reminder of 3 other times someone felt let down. A small frustration suddenly carries a weight that feels disproportionate if you only look at the surface of what was said. And this is so often the part that couples misunderstand the most. They assume the sharpness means the issue itself must be bigger than it appears, when often what they are hearing is an accumulation of pain attaching itself to the present moment. A wife may sound irritated about something minor, but underneath it may be the exhaustion of having tried many, many times to explain what matters to her and feeling that it still does not fully register. A husband may react strongly to what seems like criticism because he no longer hears only one comment. He is hearing years of feeling that whatever he does eventually becomes evidence that he is still falling short. That is why some arguments become strangely detailed, almost as if both people are gathering evidence rather than trying to understand each other. And by that point, the conversation is often carrying an emotional history that neither person is fully naming while they are speaking. And when hurt has been sitting there for a really long time, people often stop choosing words carefully. Not always because they want to wound each other, but because they're tired, they're feeling discouraged, and they no longer trust that using a softer tone and softer words will make enough of a difference. That is when tone begins doing damage even when the original issue is small. A sentence that could have been spoken gently comes out with an edge. A correction sounds more like contempt, and a sigh carries all sorts of meaning. Even silence starts feeling loaded. And because both people are already sensitive to what has happened before, they often react not only to the sentence itself, but to everything that they believe it means. This is also why couples sometimes describe feeling confused after conflict. They know the argument looks small on paper, yet both people walked away carrying something much heavier than the actual topic would suggest. What they are feeling is not simply the moment itself. They are feeling how many moments before it still remain unsettled. Unless that deeper layer is recognized, couples often keep arguing as if each conflict started today, when in reality, very few of them do. For many men, resentment does not always sound like resentment at first, because anger is often the emotion that rises fastest when something deeper has not been named. That does not mean anger is the only thing here. Usually, it is carrying several things underneath it at once. Things like disappointment, feeling misunderstood, feeling powerless to change what keeps happening, feeling hurt by how distant things have become, and often a growing fear that no matter what they do, they are not enough and they are still getting it wrong. The anger arrives first because it gives shape to emotions that otherwise feel harder to sit in and hold. It creates movement where vulnerability can feel exposed. It offers energy where helplessness feels uncomfortable. And for many, many men, especially those who have spent much of their life solving problems professionally, staying composed and pushing through discomfort, anger can feel more familiar than sitting inside emotions that do not immediately lead anywhere clear. That is why a man may sound irritated when what he is actually feeling is deeply discouraged. He may become sharp when underneath that sharpness is sadness he has not fully admitted, even to himself. He may react strongly to a small moment because what gets touched is much older than the conversation happening in front of him. Sometimes it's not only about what his wife just said, it's also about how many times he has already felt unsuccessful, unseen, unwanted, or uncertain about how to reach her in ways that don't backfire. And because many men are less practiced at slowing down long enough to sort through those layers while the conflict is happening, anger often becomes the quickest available language and tool. That is also why many men later regret how they came across. Once the moment passes, they often know their reaction was bigger than they intended. But in the moment, the anger feels so justified because it was carrying so much more than the surface issue. What often makes this harder is that anger tends to hide the very thing that most needs to be understood. A man may sound forceful when underneath it he is thinking, I do not know how to get this right anymore. He may sound frustrated when what he is feeling is, I hate how far apart we've become. He may sound defensive when underneath there is real shame, especially if he knows part of what she is saying has truth in it, but he does not know how to stay open without feeling too exposed. And when anger becomes the main thing his wife experiences, she usually responds to the anger itself rather than the pain underneath it, which means both people leave the conversation even further apart. He feels more misunderstood. She feels less safe. And now another moment has been added to the growing pile of interactions neither of them knows how to fully repair. And that's why anger in marriage is rarely just anger. Very often it is unspoken hurt, disappointment, fear, resentment, and resentment arriving in the only form that feels immediately available. The encouraging part in all of this is that couples do not usually need dramatic change to begin shifting the tone between them, but they do need different moments than the ones that they have been repeating. Because repair rarely happens through one perfect conversation. It happens when one person stays present in a moment where they normally would have defended, explained themselves, or withdrawn, or reacted sharply, and something softer has room to happen instead. Sometimes that soft moment is simply listening longer than you normally would. Sometimes it's resisting the urge to correct details when the larger point is that someone you love is trying, yes, imperfectly, to tell you what something felt like from their side. Sometimes it's being willing to say, I can hear why that stayed with you, without immediately reaching for why you had a different intention. That kind of response does not erase what happened, but it changes what happens next. And often that matters more than you know. Because when a person feels emotionally met, even if they don't do it very well, The conversation often stops needing to keep returning in the same way. And that is important because many couples are not exhausted from the major issue. They're exhausted from living inside the same unfinished moments over and over again. I sometimes see this in couples where the husband feels deeply unheard, and that pain is real. And at the same time, his wife has become so emotionally tired from years of conversation that felt dismissive that her tone now carries that exhaustion even when she doesn't intend it to. She comes across as short. He hears rejection. He pulls further back or becomes frustrated. And now both of them are reacting to what the other person sounds like, while neither one feels fully understood underneath it all. That's why repair matters long before a marriage feels truly stuck. Not when a marriage feels broken, but when the tone first begins to shift. When conversations start leaving residue. When patience shortens and both people begin assuming the worst. Because once resentment settles in, people often stop believing that softer moments will matter. Even though those softer moments are usually where change starts to begin. Repair is not perfection. It's not about having every conversation go beautifully. It's about learning how to recognize when hurt has entered the room and responding before that hurt turns into one more piece of evidence that the relationship is doomed and is becoming harder to live inside. The first real shift is simply understanding that what looks repetitive on the surface is often pain that still does not feel finished underneath. When couples begin to see that more clearly, they often become less harsh with each other. No, everything isn't solved, but they finally understand what has been happening for much, much longer than they realized. Hope this helps. Take care. We'll see you next time. Thanks for being here. If something in this episode hit home, don't forget to subscribe and leave a review. It helps more men find the support they need. And if you are ready to get help or take the next step, you'll find the link to book a free call in the show notes. I'll see you next time.